Christina is joining us today from the College of Wooster, Ohio, where she teaches courses in British and South Asian history in the Faculty of History. Christina's interest in British history was stimulated by her grandmother, who grew up in Manchester. In her teens, Christina read British history voraciously, broadening her interest as an undergraduate to the development of the British Empire. Her PhD at Princeton was undertaken under the supervision of distinguished British historian Linda Colley and was published by Cambridge University Press in August as The Company's Sword. The format of tonight's lecture is that Christina will talk for about 55 minutes, followed by question and answer. Please key any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Christina after her talk. Welcome, Christina. The rostrum is yours.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for that introduction, and thank you also for this invitation to speak. I was really excited for the opportunity, and thank you also to the audience for showing up on what may be a rainy day for you or whatever weather it is where you are. I'll get into things, but I'm really excited to answer questions at the end of the talk as well. So I want to start on August 11th, 1809. A detachment of British dragoons made their way toward the squat fortress of Seringapatam under a steady bombardment. At least one dragoon had his horse shot out from under him, and several camp followers were killed. A sense of déjà vu must have hung over the corps. Almost exactly a decade earlier, British forces had stormed this very fort, which had stood as the stronghold of Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore and the company's long-standing rival for military power in South India. The siege had quickly become the stuff of national mythology, and accounts, paintings, and maps of the action had circulated widely across the empire. This time, though, the cannon harrying the dragoons was not under Tipu's control. He had been killed in the 1799 siege, and Mysore had fallen under company control, with its titular new ruler, Krishna Raja Wodeyar III, hemmed in by coercive terms of a subsidiary alliance. In keeping with that treaty, Wodeyar had even sent his own detachment of cavalry as reinforcement for the dragoons. In 1809, Seringapatam was under the control of British officers, members of the British East India Company's armies who were in a state of open mutiny. They were backed up by more than 1,000 other officers across the company's Madras presidency, its southernmost administration, all calling for the removal of the civil governor, George Hilaro Barlow. Aghast at this crisis, Barlow and his supporters denounced the mutiny as a desperate experiment, forcing government of substituting, in effect, a stratocracy. Stratocracy from the Greek stratos for army, so a state ruled by its army, which, according to Thomas Strange, was the worst of all governments. Embedded in these condemnations was an assumption. The mutineers' attempt to bring about stratocracy was an anomaly, a break from the proper operations of the colonial state. Yet, by 1809, it was already conventional wisdom in Britain that the East India Company ruled India by the sword. In a literal sense, the company's expanding territories were secured through conquest and coercive treaty, maintained by the sword. At a more profound level, rule by the sword referred to the role that military actors, or at least that British officers who constituted the company's military elite, played in the company's administration, regularly overruling and outranking their civil counterparts. Even in 1809, despite initial condemnations of the officers' mutiny as treasonous, the officers' demands astonishingly were largely met. I will return to the resulting rebellion later in this talk, but here it is sufficient simply to note that Barlow was, in fact, recalled from India in disgrace. Equally significant, no officer, not even those who had fired on the Royal Dragoons, was executed or jailed for participating in the rebellion. And instead, several officers who had stayed loyal to the civil government were hounded out of the service altogether. Though the significance of the company's military as a tool of colonial expansion is universally acknowledged by scholars, existing scholarship has been reluctant to consider the political role of those military institutions. Most studies of the colonial state have concentrated on its civil administration. Echoing Britons who saw the events of 1809 as an aberration, such scholarship often prevents incidents in which military actors subverted or overcame the civil state as a disruption of norms. Douglas Pearce, whose book Between Mars and Mammon is an important exception to these trends, challenges this model, instead describing the company's empire as a whole as a garrison state, in which armies, officers, barracks, and troops were the most readily visible and ubiquitously powerful part of the colonial government. My book, The Company's Sword, seeks to expand on this analysis and to explain how the tenets of stratocracy, regularly and openly condemned by colonial officials and their fellow Britons, nevertheless proved intractable in the colonial state. In short, what role did the East India Company's armies play in the colonial state and its ideologies? This question, I argue, can only be answered as the product of companies' efforts to negotiate and to assert power in two contexts, that of South Asia and that of the British Empire. The analysis, in turn, inverts the conventional geography of British India, decentering the Bengal presidency, the center of its civil administration, instead to focus on Madras, the southerly subordinate presidency that throughout the 18th century was the most active vanguard of colonial warfare, in part because of conflict with Tipu Sultan and the state of Mysore. There were 4 such wars in the late 18th century. I argue that it was here in Madras that the framework of stratocracy was first catalyzed by colonial officers and combatants of all sorts as they sought to navigate a dizzying array of military and political networks. More than a local or regional story, confined to the South, stratocracy soon spread, shaping all of the company's territories and operations. As we will see, the superiority of the British officers, logistically, socially, and politically, emerged as an antidote to colonial anxieties in this period, first in a strategic context and then more broadly. In this talk, I hope to show this development as it shaped 3 interlinked aspects of the colonial state, tracing the officers' dominance first within the company's military institutions, then in the company's external diplomatic affairs, and finally in British metropolitan politics. Officers' paramountcy in each of these spaces meant that any effort to check their demands, even in cases of open mutiny, threatened key foundations of the company's claim to power. At the same time, the very pervasiveness of stratocracy was a vulnerability, one that ultimately helps to explain the rapidity of the company's dissolution after the rebellions of 1857, when its officers proved singularly unable to uphold its promises. Victorian-era historians tended to describe the company in its origins as a body of peaceful traders, one that only later, surprisingly and reluctantly, turned into a military power. More recent scholarship, particularly that by Philip Stern, has effectively challenged this imagined dichotomy. The company from its inception was meant to expand and to assert English interests in the Indian Ocean, and this was not a pacifist goal. As one early company official remarked, the company operated with the sword in one hand and money in the other, establishing fortified factories, coercing favorable trading terms from local rulers, and battling with rivals like the Dutch and the Portuguese for access to rich trade networks. Such operations in turn required a supply of military labor, and as colonial actors everywhere in the expanding English Empire discovered in the 17th century, there simply were not enough would-be soldiers in England to meet this demand. From the swamps of Virginia to the sugarcane fields of Barbados to the busy docks of Bombay, colonial agents solved this problem in the same way, by enlisting local forms of military labor. Already in 1615, only a few years after the company's first voyages to the Indian Ocean, its agents were collecting information about how to engage with the military labor market in India. Thomas Roe, a quasi-corporate negotiator, quasi-ambassador, sent by the company to the court of Jahangir, carefully recorded in his journal the rates needed to hire Indian guards, escorts, and even spies. Reliance on this military labor, though, produced new anxieties as colonial agents struggled to maintain control of the martial prestige and power of these forces. Company officials in the 17th and early 18th century initially seem to have resolved these anxieties by keeping their local military recruits at arm's length from their expanding formal military systems. By the 1660s, the company had a small but expanding corps of European officers with a few hundred soldiers under their command. But Indian recruits, usually termed peons, were not integrated into this system and were described instead as temporary levies, denied any permanent position in the company's military infrastructure. As an aside, this practice gave the company's formal military systems an anemic appearance, helping perhaps to explain why the early corporation was for so long seen as a peaceful body. In the 1740s in Madras, though, things began to change. When war with the French spread into the Indian Ocean, the French East India Company, headquartered at Pondicherry, seized the British stronghold at Madras. Company officials, taking refuge in nearby Fort St. David, scrambled to mount a response. To support their efforts, officials in Bombay sent an expeditionary force, including a number of Indian recruits termed sepoys, from the Mughal Persian word sipa, or soldier. As conflict with the French continued for years, running effectively unabated until 1761, the size of the Madras Army's field force expanded to an unprecedented level, comprising more than 10,000 men by 1766. Unlike earlier levies of peons, the Indian soldiers who made up these campaigns were formally incorporated into its armies, organized into increasingly sophisticated hierarchies and establishments, including the creation of a fledgling Indian officer corps, initially with the ranks of Subadar and Jemadar. At the lowest level of this hierarchy stood sepoys, a word that no longer had anything to do with origins in Bombay. And here you can see a very early muster roll that has multiple types of Indian military labor. On the one side, you can see a list of peons, and on the other side, you can see a list of sepoys. So we're starting to see this proliferation. Anyone who has studied colonial India knows what a sepoy is. He is a soldier, or more specifically, he is an Indian recruit trained and drilled in the European style, that is to say, in tactics like volley firing and parade maneuver. Yet, there's actually little evidence that the earliest sepoys in the company ever received such instruction. The most prolific historian of the Madras Army, W.J. Wilson, spoke disparagingly of these early recruits. The first sepoy levies had no discipline nor any idea that discipline was required. They were armed with matchlocks, bows and arrows, spears, swords, bucklers, daggers, or any other weapon that they could get. We should be careful in giving too much credence to Wilson, whose work is consistently dismissive of the abilities and reliability of sepoys and Indian officers, an attitude that was not uncommon in British India after the events of 1857. Nevertheless, if there is any formal method of training for sepoys in this early period, no trace of it remains in the records. The earliest attempt to standardize sepoys training in the Madras Army that I can find comes from 1759, when the troops were first organized into battalions. Why then did the term sepoy become so prolific so early? What explains the shift away from peon? And indeed, if that change was entirely due to their Europeanized training, why were these new modeled recruits not simply termed soldiers, like their white counterparts? Already we have seen that colonial agents across the British Empire were eager to divide European and indigenous military labor into distinct categories. Indian combatants formally incorporated into the company's standing armies disrupted the existing system of classification and exclusion. The term sepoy, though, offered a third such category. Indian military labor transformed by its formal incorporation into the company's institutions. By making putative training the defining feature of sepoys, a potential vulnerability was turned into proof of European prowess, in this case, the ability to train. In one of the first attempts in Madras to give order to the expanding military establishment, Stringer Lawrence, the first commander of the Madras Army, wrote, "The good order and discipline of the troops is owing entirely to the care that officers take. The sepoy officers are very remiss naturally. It is therefore recommended to the European officers who will have the care of this body to infuse as much as possible the spirit of command amongst them," at once praising European officers for their ability to command while denigrating their European counterparts. In 1766, the company's court of directors, the governing body in London, echoed the same, writing that sepoys' superiority over sepoys in the country service, country in this case just means India, consist only in their discipline, which, wanting European officers, they soon lose under the country government. The supposed transformative power of officers' command was an enduring claim. Half a century later, in 1808, John Malcolm, the future governor of Bombay and an officer in the Madras Army, waxed poetic on a similar theme, writing, and you can see the longer quote here, but if you look towards the end of it, you can see that sepoys possess an incalculable superiority over the other natives of India, as long as they are armed, disciplined, and directed by the art, intelligence, and spirit of their European leaders. This, Malcolm insisted, was not just a reflection of European officers' abilities, but equally of the failings of the sepoys themselves. Without British leadership, he wrote, sepoys, quote, appear hardly to consider themselves as full moral agents, and blindly resign their judgment in almost all cases to the law of usage, the dictates of the priests, or the influence of their superior in caste or station. The term sepoy thus implied a system of command and training that reified the racial hierarchies of colonial society long before those had formal shape in civil spheres. As an aside, the origins and racial composition of the company's military recruits in this period were in fact considerably more complex than the binary categories of Black/Indian, White/European allowed. The mixed race descendants of Portuguese colonists, whose inclusion as part of the white population of Madras had long been the subject of debate, were employed in the margins of the Madras army as topasses, or sometimes as Black Portuguese, and other military personnel, including enslaved African soldiers, mostly from Madagascar, called Kafris, posed similar categorical concerns. In general, though, one can say that the trend within the company's forces at Madras and elsewhere after the 1750s was to limit these discrepancies or otherwise to render them invisible, for instance, by dissolving the Kafri Corps and restricting Portuguese recruits to the fife and drummer corps, which you can see pictured here. Company efforts to impose a binary in its emerging military hierarchies were further complicated by the sepoys themselves. Company officials, after all, were not the only ones who could ascribe strategic, social, or political meaning to the system that they had created. Sepoys had their own interpretations. Unfortunately, evidence of these ideas is hard to come by. There is only one known memoir by a sepoy in the 18th century, the autobiography of Dean Muhammad, which he actually published in English in Ireland to sell to former company officers. As Michael Fisher's edited edition of the memoir clearly lays out, Dean Muhammad's memoir sought to situate the erstwhile Subadar within a British gentlemanly context, thus obscuring the complexities of his Indian context. Some of you may also be familiar with Sitaram Pandey's 19th century memoir, again from the Bengal Army. I share the view of scholars such as Alison Safady and Kim Wagner that this is a fictional pastiche rather than an authentic autobiography, but in either case, it belongs to a different era than this early period. So, without direct sources into the views of sepoys in the 18th century, we are pressed to look into the company's records to gain glimpses of sepoys who approached their employment in ways that radically challenged the company's expectations. One dramatic example of this innovation is the career of Muhammad Yusuf Khan, one of the Madras Army's earliest commissioned Indian officers. In 1754, Yusuf Khan became the company's first native commandant, a title that broke from the Madras presidency's custom of borrowing Indian ranks from Indian military networks, but which nevertheless kept Yusuf Khan excluded from the European officer corps. Yusuf Khan, though, was not satisfied with his status as the best of the B team and sought more power both militarily and politically. In 1758, he was sent on expedition to Madurai and Tirunelveli, which you can see here, territories far to the south in India that were claimed by one of the company's allies, Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja of Arcot, but which remained outside of his control. Yusuf Khan's expedition proved phenomenally successful, and he remitted a steady flow of cash back to Madras. But Yusuf Khan did not see this just as a military assignment. Rather, he treated his expedition as a political and territorial grant. He began to style himself the Commandant Sahib, which you can see is a transliteration of commandant, and even created a seal for himself, drawing on Mughal Persian governmental traditions, emblazoned with the date 1168 in the Islamic calendar, which works out to 1754 in the Common Era, the year that he had received his promotion to commandant. In short, Yusuf Khan used his commission to present himself as a vassal, ruling Madurai and Tirunelveli in the name of the company. In 1762, Yusuf Khan launched an invasion of nearby Travancore in an apparent bid to expand his territories. George Pigott, then the governor of Madras, condemned the war in a furious tirade. By whose authority is it that you do this? Are you a sovereign that you take upon you to make war upon independent states? You are, I fear, grown giddy with power. I advise you to read this letter with attention and then recollect who you are and what you are. The language offered no ambiguity about who and what Yusuf Khan was in Pigott's eyes, a commandant with a set of military obligations, but no political power. The company quickly mobilized against Yusuf Khan, and after 2 years of exhausting sieges, the Commandant Sahib was finally captured and executed, his vision of political power sharply refuted. After Yusuf Khan's defeat, company officials were determined to ensure that no such ambitious Indian officer could hew a similar path for themselves. Most urgently, the Madras government established new barriers between its ever-growing pool of Indian military labor and political authority. Already excluded from the company's internal government, Indian officers were further barred from gaining a foothold in Indian political networks. As the Madras government promised their employers in London in 1767, you may be assured we shall be careful never to appoint subadars of sepoys to be renters of countries, amaldars. It was troublesome times and a country to be reduced that made it appear expedient to put that confidence in Yusuf Khan, of which he gave us sufficient cause to repent. The company's interests in Madurai and Tirunelveli were subsequently managed by European officers. This change was part of a pattern in the company's armies. Over and over again, attempts to restrict and to manage sepoys' ambitions resulted in an expansion of status and prestige for European officers. Indeed, after the rapid rise of the Madras Army's Indian Officer Corps in the 1750s and 1760s, the rest of the century was one of gradual collapse and curtailment. In 1784, the Madras government dispensed entirely with the rank of native commandant and substantially diminished the standing of the next highest rank, subadar. The logic for these changes reflected the now well-established assumption that sepoys and their Indian officers could neither be fully relied upon nor entirely effective unless under European command. Commandants were thus seen as superfluous because, as the commander of the Madras army put it, when they are clever men, their influence on the native officers and sepoys becomes dangerous, and when they are not so, they can be of no use. In their stead, the company expanded the European Officer Corps, and officers as junior as ensigns were given command to lead sepoy detachments. The growing disparity between the European and Indian officer corps within the company had social implications alongside its strategic importance. Since the company's British officers were meant, essentially, from their arrival in India to outrank even the most senior Indian officer, this meant they needed wages sufficient to maintain themselves in such a station. In 1776, a group of ensigns in the Madras army complained that they were living with the greatest frugality, that is, spending only what was necessary on servants, a barber, a launderer, European wine, and either a palanquin or a horse for exercise, they still couldn't make ends meet with their monthly allowance. Side note, if anyone wants to start an exercise program that consists entirely of being carried on a palanquin, I think that would be a hit. The Madras government, which for reasons that go beyond the scope of this talk, was at the time desperate for allies in the officer corps, actually agreed to restore a lucrative allowance to these officers to prevent them, as they said, from employing their time and attention in ways and means inconsistent with their character and station. This grant occurred at the same time that company agents who had gotten rich quick in India were becoming a scandal in Britain. Officers were not immune from such criticism, but the importance given to officers' ability to command and to overawe their sepoys turned the social and financial ambitions into a strategic concern, making the reduction of profits a security risk for empire. Sepoys, though, were not the only actors company officers had to impress. Officers demanded a similar spectacle of wealth to appeal to the Indian population at large. In 1773, John Johnstone wrote, and you can see this on the slide, the genius, that is to say, the kind of internal character of Bengal, and the generous, not to say profuse spirit diffused through the inhabitants of it, obliges every field officer at the head of a corps to display what our countrymen call Old English hospitality, as much for the sake of his importance as his popularity. It is here that I want to turn to the second context in which officers' claims of superiority gained political salience, the company's external diplomacy. Just like Yusuf Khan, Indian rulers, officials, and combatants in other forces engaged with the company's armies in ways that often challenged or circumvented official expectations. By the late 18th century, despite the company's early assurances that no country ruler would be able to replicate their system of training, sepoy-style forces, drilled and clad in the same Europeanized aesthetic as the company troops, proliferated in armies across the subcontinent. And on the slide, you can see, and I'll zoom in here, the Europeanized armies under French command of the Nizam of Hyderabad, and I'll come back to this force momentarily. Their development was as much symbolic as it was strategic. Indian rulers from the 16th century onward had boasted of the ability to draw military recruits from a wide range of networks across Asia and the Indian Ocean. Sepoy regiments dressed in the European style extended that claim into a new set of military networks. In keeping with this vision of far-flung military patronage, Indian rulers were equally eager to attract European officers to command their forces, a fact that gave white officers in India new opportunities for professional, political, and financial advancement. A particularly lavish example of these exchanges' diplomatic and political value can be found in this ornately decorated commission, which was issued to George Buck by the Nawab Wala Jah of Arcot in 1779. With heavy illumination and gold-flecked paper, this was clearly a document meant to carry prestige. And it is a bilingual one, printed first in Persian and then in English, that sought to communicate that prestige across cultural lines. It's particularly interesting to me that Buck was granted the rank of colonel, and colonel is transliterated from English into Persian in the commission, rather than translated into a Persian title, a hint that Buck's value to Wala Jah lay in his Europeanness. The appointment was a profitable one for Buck as well. He received substantial gifts from Wala Jah, indeed enough of them that they actually came under parliamentary scrutiny later as part of the wider crisis over the Nawab's debts. And simultaneously, Buck was able to draw pay and allowance from the Madras army. This dubious arrangement, known as a dual commission, was not uncommon in this era, and suggests that it was not just the officers and their Indian employers who hoped to gain from these appointments. Company officials, too, were eager to have their interests represented in Indian courts by military men connected to the company's hierarchies. Officers who found themselves disappointed for promotion within the company's ranks could look to this external market as an alternate way to advance in colonial society. Maya Jasanoff and Rosie Llewellyn-Jones have both done excellent work on such figures, including men such as Benoit de Boyne or Claude Martin, who made names for themselves, as Jasanoff says, at the edge of empire. Yet this arrangement also had a cost, raising the familiar specter of loss of control over martial prestige. Already in 1786, Charles Cornwallis warned that British officers serving in Indian armies could be the source of greatest evils. A decade later, Lord Hobart, governor of Madras, elaborated on this, noting, "Should we supply Indian rulers with persons undeserving of confidence and unfit for command, they would in the first place not answer the purpose you have in view, and in the second disgrace our countrymen. On the other hand, should we select those who are most trustworthy and most competent, we should hazard a great deal from the success of their exertions." Historian Anne-Laura Stoller has written extensively about the figure of the European pauper as a subject of colonial anxiety, one that might undermine claims of white supremacy by his very existence, proving that a white man could be poor. European officers drawing gifts or dual commissions from their appointment had little in common with such figures, but for some colonial officials, their presence in Indian armies represented a similar vulnerability: the possibility that the carefully cultivated myth of white military prowess could be dashed with an ignominious or dishonorable defeat. By the 1790s, then, a growing number of administrators began to call for the prohibition on this kind of adventuring. Had such a restriction occurred in isolation, it might in fact have reduced the officers' political power in the colonial state, disconnecting them from the company's external affairs. In practice, the reverse occurred. The push to eliminate the presence of European officers in Indian armies gave such men a new, more formalized position in the company's diplomacy. And a clear example of this process can be seen in 1798, when we return to the infantry forces of Hyderabad, which I showed you a few slides before. The company's relationship with Hyderabad in this red circle had been ambivalent throughout the 18th century, stuttering between alliance, animosity, and neutrality. In the 1790s, though, the Nizam of Hyderabad, Asif Jah II, pursued a campaign of rapid militarization, aiming to gain ground in his ongoing disputes with the Maratha Confederacy. In the spate of only a few years, he built up an infantry of some 15,000 troops. Two aspects of this force alarmed British officials. The first is that they were commanded predominantly by French officers, including one whom company officials deemed an outrageous Jacobin. Second, many of the recruits in the Nizam's infantry, at least allegedly, came from the company's own ranks. Asif Jah was willing to pay a premium for sepoys and Indian officers who deserted from the company and brought their training into his own armies. Significantly, here again, we see a way that sepoys were creating their own path for advancement, even as opportunities for promotion in the Madras army were declining. They were basically turning the Madras army into a sort of jobs training program. Learning of these developments, Richard Wellesley began what would prove to be a famously expansionist tenure as Governor General, with the goal of eliminating Hyderabad's armies. Even before he arrived in India, he was in conversation with William and James Achilles Kirkpatrick, brothers and political residents in Hyderabad. They presented Wellesley with a range of options, ultimately recommending that a cadre of British mercenaries be sent to displace the French, but that the corps otherwise remain under the control of Asif Jah. Wellesley rejected this possibility, loath to relinquish control of the company's European officers to an Indian ruler. Instead, Wellesley pursued a policy that came to be known as subsidiary alliance, in which Hyderabad was forced to dissolve its independent armies and to subsidize an expeditionary force from the company to provide for its protection. Though Asif Jah paid handsomely for these troops, he had no authority over them. Company officials insisted that the expeditionary force was not to be used on trifling occasions, such as revenue collection, which might reduce the prestige of the company's armies. This, though, was a disingenuous demand. In the company's territories, regiments were regularly used for such duties, suggesting that the restrictions placed on the use of subsidiary troops had less to do with issues of discipline and efficacy and more about who had the power to decide when the use of military force was legitimate, honorable, or appropriate. The answer to that question lay in two figures: the company's political resident and the military commander of the expeditionary force. The former position was one that could go to either civilian or military agents, but it is no coincidence that military residents outnumbered their civilian counterparts for the vast majority of the company's rule. Even when the resident was a civilian, the presence of the expeditionary commander meant that an officer was always minutely involved in the day-to-day operations of subsidiary alliance. Even as the company's expansion thus eliminated officers' opportunities outside of its structures, the tight interconnectedness between the army and diplomacy ensured that European officers remained the most visible embodiments of the company's authority. By the end of the 18th century, then, claims about European officers' prestige, power, and genius for command were woven into both the company's internal and external management. The twin developments in turn facilitated the officer corps' rise in a third context: British metropolitan politics. Officers' position within the colonial state gave them a staying power in an era of extensive imperial reform. Famously, the expansion of the company's empire in the late 18th century sparked fierce controversy in Britain, including a wave of hostility towards nabobs, a term derived from the Indian nawab, ruler or viceroy, converted into a racialized epithet against the company's nouveau riche. Company officers, especially those who had acquired gifts or dual commissions, fit squarely within this critique. And we can see here a satire that has an emaciated royal officer who's just got a handkerchief of gain compared to a British company officer with stacks and piles of money and various other rewards. And these criticisms led some, including some of Britain's foremost politicians, to call for the dissolution of the colonial army entirely. In 1784, Henry Dundas, as colonial secretary, exclaimed, "I cannot conceive of anything more preposterous than that the East India Company should be holding in their hands a large European army, exclusive of the crown, to be recruited from the subjects of this country." Instead, Pitt's government, of which Dundas was a part, called for the consolidation of the company's military, its incorporation into the British Army proper, and invested Charles Cornwallis as Governor General to carry this out. Throughout this period, the social status and patronage networks of company officers were in a state of flux, something that I discuss in more detail in my book. But it can be said in general that company officers lacked the connections and capital needed to advance far in the Royal Army. And indeed, some company officers like Iroquois and Stringer Lawrence were actually former royal officers who had come to the company when their hopes for advancement were disappointed. Given these dynamics, company officers furiously opposed the plan for consolidation. Their protests reveal both the growing reach of company officers and their solidifying sense of themselves as part of a shared community. I call this community an elite military public in my book. Borrowing from other, more revolutionary political movements in this period, the officers established correspondence networks that stretched across India, a lobbying committee in London, and even a pamphleteering campaign that circulated material in both India and in Britain. At times, the committees even made use of the same rights-based rhetoric that flitted across the Atlantic in this period, speaking of the soldiers' just rights and of broken compacts with the state. And on this slide, you can see the queries answered is one of the most widely circulated pamphlets that contains a lot of this rhetoric. Alongside such language, though, the officers made use of less radical, and I would argue more effective, claims focused on their military prowess, arguing that they deserved at least as much, if not more, credit for the maintenance of empire as did the British Army proper. Consolidation, which they argued would necessarily reduce their prestige, would reduce their apparent status and thus their ability to lead their sepoys who were so swayed by the spectacle of their authority. In and of themselves, though, these lobbying campaigns were not enough. In 1794, after more than a decade of debate, Cornwallis announced that he was moving ahead with consolidation. When news of this broke in India, officers in Madras and Bengal mounted what John Shore, Cornwallis's successor as Governor General, described as protests of a very violent and not to say treasonable nature. In two upcountry garrisons in the Bengal presidency, Kanpur and Fatehgarh, which you can see there, officers were said to have voted in favor of a resolution to throw off all allegiance to government in March if their complaints hadn't been answered, and the seizure of the Governor General and Commander-in-Chief, and to compel by force of arms all to join them. Yet, when the Court of Directors announced their determination to crush and to punish the rebellion, one angry proprietor rose in a general meeting of the company to denounce any such reprisal on the basis of the officers' existing track record. He said, "Good God, sir, is such to be the promised satisfaction to the army? To men whose bravery, good conduct, enterprise, and success you owe your present exalted situation, those imperial monuments of valor, your extensive kingdoms in Asia, and those princely revenues so necessary to your very existence, in fact, to whom you owe the acquisition of a second world." In short, the prominent role that officers held in the expansion and maintenance of empire made the possibility of harsh punishment, even in the face of mutiny, disgraceful, at least to some observers. At the same time, there are also hints that even those officials less impressed by officers' bravery, good conduct, enterprise, and success were nevertheless wary of challenging the core. Holden Ferber, Shore's biographer, wrote that the embattled governor general saw officers' command over their sepoys as a real check to his power. To quote, an intrepid European officer with a few thousand loyal sepoys at his back could have, for a brief space of time, wielded paramount authority over a considerable portion of the country. Here, the strength and reliability of the company's army was imagined as a weakness, a reason why the colonial government could not counter its officers' demands. Plans for consolidation were scrapped, and in its place, a heavily watered down set of reforms were sent to India in 1798, grandly referred to as the company's military charter. At first glance, the name seems absurdly grandiose for a very minor set of changes. However, if we see those reforms instead as a rejection of a more wholesale consolidation that had initially been intended, they become more significant. Proof of an officer corps that was increasingly able to resist interference from other authorities in the colonial state. The defeat of Cornwallis's reforms brings us back to the crisis with which I opened my talk, the mutiny of more than 1,000 white officers in the Madras Army in the summer of 1809. In the decade since the collapse of the consolidation movement, many of the company's civil officials had sought ways to chip away at officers' power. A series of military and diplomatic victories in the South at the turn of the 19th century had seemed an ideal opportunity. With the company's growing dominance in the region, some argued that the Madras presidency no longer needed such a massive standing army. One such reform-minded official was George Hilaro Barlow, who became governor of Madras in 1808. Within his first year, Barlow introduced several new policies meant to reduce the scope of the Madras army. He removed the commander-in-chief from the general council in the Madras government, set up a new system of civil magistrates and collectors with authority to overrule commanders in Indian towns and villages, and granted civilian contractors control over equipping the army, something previously done by the officers themselves. Importantly, this was actually a huge blow to officers' profits. Contracts for the equipment at the time worked by contractors being given a lump sum, and they were allowed to keep whatever funds were not spent on the equipment for personal use. The problem of commanders being in charge of equipping their own regiments in that system should be fairly obvious. Officers correctly interpreted Barlow's policy changes as an effort to reduce their power and profit on the colonial stage. One officer complained about the growing prominence of civil agents, writing, "In the place of the old and experienced officer, to whom they, Indian subjects, have long looked with respect, they see his power and ascendancy passed away, and the youthful, inexperienced judge or boyish collector occupy all and more than his former place." Here we see that familiar rhetoric about the idea of officers able to command the Indian population at large. By May, some 90% of the Madras Army's officer corps had forsworn Barlow's legitimacy. Regiments in Hyderabad, in St. Thomas Mount near Madras, Masulipatam, and Seringapatam were most active in the mutiny. But it was widespread throughout the presidency and even won sympathy in Bengal and Bombay. Officials writing back to London warned that they were teetering on the verge of civil war. And at no point did this seem more likely than on August 11th, the day that the Royal Dragoons made their approach towards Seringapatam. When, near to the fort, they intercepted a regiment of sepoys commanded by a mutinying officer on its way to reinforce the rebels, open battle broke out, one that would ultimately leave as many as 150 sepoys and Indian officers dead on the field. However, rather than the start of a civil war, the skirmish proved a climax. Within days, officers across the presidency were reluctantly reasserting their loyalty to Barlow. The clash at Seringapatam, alongside rumors of the imminent arrival of Lord Minto, Governor General, were often identified as reasons for surrender, but the timing nor the geography of the rebellion collapse really fit this explanation. The first regiment to surrender was the Expeditionary Force in Hyderabad on August 11th, which was much too soon to have heard about a battle taking place that same day, some 300 miles away. And Minto did not actually arrive in Madras until September. I argue instead that the collapse of the mutiny was a direct result of the tools that Barlow had used to try to check it. Faced with the officers' disobedience, Barlow had sought to circumvent them and to mobilize the Madras Army's vast sepoy force, independent of their European commanders. He urged sepoys to ignore their officers and to heed the civil government, even going so far as to have orders translated into local languages and circulated clandestinely within sepoy barracks. In fact, Barlow's appeals were never put to the test. The scant evidence we have from sepoys in the period suggests that the officers' revolt was not a cause that appealed to them particularly. And after the clash at Seringapatam, we do have a petition from the surviving Indian officers from the regiment that was involved in the battle that wrote a formal petition to Barlow saying, "We know nothing of the consequence of matters raised between His Majesty's troops and the Honorable Company. We submissively beg your goodness and consider to show some means to us, and we glad to serve under your authority, if your goodness please to employ at any place." In the immediate aftermath of the mutiny's collapse, company officials in both India and Britain congratulated Barlow for his expert handling of the crisis. His supporters insisted that he belonged within the pantheon of imperial heroes, comparing him to Robert Clive, who had faced down an officers' mutiny of his own in 1766. Yet the imperial mood quickly soured on the governor. In 1811, Barlow would be recalled, his reputation tarnished into that of a foolhardy despot, for whom, as Charles Metcalfe put it, deductions of pence and farthings are considered more important than the fate of empire. Adding insult to injury, Barlow actually arrived in Britain to discover that his wife had been carrying on a lengthy affair with his cousin and secretary, a scandal that came to light in protracted divorce proceedings in Parliament. In his place, the Madras government would be shaped by some of Barlow's fiercest opponents, the men who had sympathized with or even participated in the mutiny's dangerous experiments in stratocracy. This surprising about-face focused on the very actions that had earlier won Barlow praise, his appeal to sepoys to check the rebellion. Mutinying officers insisted that their surrender was not a defeat, but rather a necessary, even selfless sacrifice made to preserve the empire against a foolish civilian. Rumors cascaded that the sepoy regiments had been fomenting a second mutiny. One widely circulated letter reported that sepoys in one cantonment were whispering, "Not long before all whiteface gone, this governor, very fine governor, he tell black men that they better than white man, and that sepoy never to mind again one word they say." This is a particularly dubious source in terms of its authenticity, but it definitely gives us a sense of the kinds of rumors that were circulating in this period. The possibility of such a revolt loomed all too readily in the white population of Madras. Only 3 years before, in 1806, sepoys at Vellore had risen up against a series of earlier reforms, and you can see Vellore pictured there, killing most of the Europeans in the fort. The revolt had been swiftly and bloodily crushed by a detachment of European cavalry, but the event gave shape to anxieties that had lurked in the colonial imagination since the company's inception. In 1809, ringleaders of the mutiny who faced court-martial after its collapse evoked that specter to explain their actions. John Bell, for instance, who was the lead mutineer in Seringapatam, explained that he had fired on Royal Dragoons to intimidate, not to destroy, to avert the horrors of a general rising of the sepoys in the garrison, and to save the lives of those who, it seemed, were acting against it. "I vindicate this act with confidence. I have saved the effusion of innocent blood. I stopped an insurrection in the garrison, the probable consequences of which can be best conjectured by those who remember the fatal incidents at Vellore." In this context, Barlow's attempt to bypass the European officers put the empire itself in jeopardy. The case was made most starkly in what would become the widest read history of the mutiny, a tract by Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm. "These officers," he wrote, "are to them sepoys the only representatives they know of the government they serve. They are the sole link in the chain of their attachment. Had this dreadful contest continued, the passions would have had their way, and a few months might have changed the character of our native soldiery and rendered them more formidable than all the enemies we ever had to encounter in India. As the initial condemnation of the rebel manifestos in 1809 suggests, many Britons were at least theoretically uncomfortable with the open politicization of military actors over their civilian counterparts. In the Indian context, though, those same Britons were far more worried about threats of sepoy revolt, of external actors taking advantage of such weakness, or of Indian soldiers pursuing their own visions of martial prestige. The European officer corps, institutionally designed and empowered to assuage these worries, was persuasively able to present itself as the sole guarantors against such violence, and in return was thus able to resist calls for reform. The power of their stratocracy was never complete, but few questioned the insistence that officers' authority was a matter of colonial stability, indeed an existential one, and the conventional wisdom thus embedded the officers' claims to supremacy within the colonial state's ideological foundations. This guarantee proved both remarkably enduring and ultimately shockingly fragile. 48 years later, after the White Mutiny of 1809, rebellion would blaze across northern India, originating in the sepoy regiments of the Bengal Army. I have kept this event as coda for my talk because I argue that the longer history of stratocracy that I have traced offers new insight into why 1857 proved so momentous in Britain and in India alike. Though British power was restored in India fairly quickly, the revolt effectively shattered the reputation of company officers, or at least their claims that they alone could provide authority and stability in the colonial state. Their supposed paternal command over sepoys became, in some accounts of the rebellion, evidence of incompetence. One particularly widely circulated anecdote described Colonel Ewart, commander at Cawnpore, rushing out among his rebelling troops, appealing to them desperately, my children, oh my children." In ironic subversion of Ewart's failed authority, one of the mutineers is later said to have mocked the colonel by asking if he approved of the neatness of the rebels' parade maneuvers. Of course, in other accounts, company officers would be elevated into the status of martyrs as Victorian Britons constructed an increasingly sacralized memory of the rebellions. The nature of their virtue and sacrifice, though, was startlingly different from the model of the ideal officer in India that had proliferated for more than a century. I argue in the closing chapter of my book that the British heroes of 1857 were hailed not for their knowledge and understanding of their sepoys, but instead for a heroism that was rooted in ideas of Britishness and militant Christianity. Company officers themselves and some of their supporters offered their own interpretations of 1857 that try to revive this older model. John Kay's influential history of the rebellions is probably the best known example of this. According to Kay, it was not that the officers' personal and spectacular control over their sepoys had failed, but rather that the officers had no longer asserted the kind of paternal relationship that had preserved sepoy loyalty in some erstwhile golden age. This claim is dubious on several grounds. Evidence that British officers' intimacy and relationship with their sepoys had deteriorated is surprisingly thin. Kay and others frequently pointed to low rates of fluency in Indian languages in the Indian officer corps, but it is not clear that linguistic skills were ever the norm. Some of the officers that Kay celebrated for their prowess in commanding sepoys, like Robert Clive, had no such knowledge. And it's interesting to me that in the 1790s, when the company began to issue articles of war in Hindustani, they included a transliteration of the Hindustani into Latin print so that officers could read the regulations aloud to their men, which suggests that the commanders of sepoy corps were not expected even to have a reading knowledge of Devanagari. More significantly, though, Kay's claims about a lost golden age falter because it envisions a past of perfect obedience that never existed. The company's records are full of examples of sepoys challenging their officers and the wider colonial military infrastructure, at times violently contesting the terms of their military service. For decades, the company's armies had sought to obscure and to delegitimate those actions. And from this perspective, the events of 1857 were a continuation of a deeply rooted conflict, remarkable not for their uniqueness, but for the unprecedented scope and scale on which they took place. I have 2 paragraphs left, Valerie, if that's all right. It was only at this stage, more than 70 years after Dundas had first demanded it, that consolidation, the merger of the company's armies with the crown, became feasible. The company itself was dissolved, and by 1860 its forces were being disbanded and reincorporated into the British Imperial Army, one centered on a vision of unified British authority. As Charles Wood, Secretary for India, during this transition put it, one army, one artillery, one mutiny act, one Queen's regulation, one Queen, and one empire. Once again, company officers mounted a furious protest against the transfer and the loss of privileges. But while the threat of sepoy rebellion was never more pointed, the officers' promise that they alone could prevent that catastrophe had never been less convincing. In the end, the imperial government that took over after 1858 did not trade the company's sword for a royal plowshare. Empire in the British Raj remained highly militaristic and just as reliant on sepoys and other forms of Indian military labor as the company had always been. However, the strand of stratocracy, the privileged position that company officers had carved for themselves in the colonial state, largely vanished, replaced with a more centralized vision of military order. The heroic officer, singly able to command and to control his men, became a figure of nostalgia, one that still holds power today as part of a romanticized vision of the British Empire. As this talk has shown, I hope, it is a figure that never existed. But examining how and why this officer became so prominent in the colonial imagination and so powerful in colonial policy reveals key tensions that shaped the British Empire in India and beyond. It highlights the systemic way that colonial policies were created to exclude and to restrict, while simultaneously bringing to light the persistent efforts by individuals to engage with that state in their own terms and with their own meanings. Together, these confrontations offer a new explanation both for the staying power of rule by the sword within the company and for the rapidity of its collapse. Thank you very much.
Christina, thank you very much for your illuminating and absolutely excellent talk. The phrase Britain held India by the sword was very familiar to me, as we discussed very early in correspondence from family sources. But since those sources were on the civil rather than the military side, I hadn't contemplated why the sword, without which Britain could not have conquered India, was subordinate. I just accepted that it was, as it is in Britain. So thank you very much for introducing us, or me at any rate, to an earlier period, the 18th century, when company army officers asserted themselves as the chief source of company authority in South India's militarized landscape, instigating a coup against the civilian governor of Madras. White mutinies, I had no idea that the 1809 one extended to 1,000 white officers, and ongoing politicking in London by the company army lobby. There was always rivalry between Indian army officers and officers of British regiments serving in India, but you take us to a period of acute competition, violence, and at times warfare between the two. Thank you for a fascinating exposition. Now we've got a few questions here, a couple of really quite long ones. The first is, thank you for this important and detailed lecture. As far as the existing archives are concerned, are there any major issues or questions that we are unable to establish the truth because there is not adequate documents available on that question or issue related to the area of your lecture or your book?
So I'll answer that first, pointing back to one of the points that I made in the lecture. And Valerie, thank you for your kind words on that. Which is that we don't have many direct sources from sepoys themselves, leaving this question of how the company's armies were perceived somewhat unanswerable in the way that we would really love to be able to do. We have a lot more about what Indian soldiers thought of the British Imperial Army in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Kate Imey's book, Faithful Fighters, is really an extraordinary study of that. But I would also say, in terms of the archives, one thing that I think is really important is that especially if you want to better understand, or if we want to better understand the way that these military institutions were sort of interacting and confronting political and military networks in India, it's actually necessary to go to archives in India that the material that the company sent back to London and that it's in the British Library today. A lot of the correspondence with country government, with Indian rulers, is actually maintained. It was never copied and sent back to London. And so I was actually able to find a lot more material by going to India to do that research than if I had just stayed in the British Library. So that's one thing that I would say. And I would also, I think there's a lot more research to be done on Indian armies in the 18th century. And that's something where the existing archives are not well cataloged for that period. And so I think the documents exist, especially in Hyderabad, but it would really need someone to kind of have a really determinedly go through a lot of that material. And I know some people who are starting to do that, and I'm really excited to see what they're going to find.
The second question is, thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned the racial binary and the elevation of European officers. What about the mixed-race children of British/European officers and soldiers? They also served in native and British armies and were prominent in the Maratha Wars. There is a striking similarity with one of the examples you gave, as Company attempted to exclude mixed-race Eurasians/East Indians from service around the 1790s, except as musicians/bandsmen. Although many individuals, most famously Colonel James Skinner, Seconder Saab, overcame these restrictions, did you leave this issue out for want of space? Is it addressed in your book, please?
Excellent question. I did leave it out of the talk just because I had to cut some stuff, but thank you very much for asking me. I was hoping to get a chance to address it more in the Q&A. And I do go into it in a little bit more detail in my book, specifically on the chapter of the sort of adventuring of officers into Indian armies. As you note, as a matter of fact, a lot of European officers, including Benoit de Boyne, actually saw the possibility of service in Indian armies as officers in Indian armies as a sort of ideal opportunity for mixed race sons that they might have had in the 18th century. And so we have some letters talking about the sort of best way to get one's son set up in that process. And so you do, especially in the Maratha armies, you see a considerable number. And you also see, though, growing sort of pressure to kind of regulate and restrict that, as you say, starting in the 1790s, both within the company and sort of in these external models. And famously, Hastings, Lord Hastings has a proclamation in that bans or prohibits European mercenaries and any mercenary who kind of connects to Britain from serving in the Maratha armies during the Anglo-Maratha Wars, and this really limits that possibility. But one of the things that I think needs more work done on it, and here I would also say Durba Ghosh has done some great work, is that when we're looking at the category of mixed race, it's a really fungible category in this period. And so even as you have these official regulations kind of barring mixed race people from entering into the army, we actually continue to see mixed race officers and soldiers in various different capacities. And I think George McMunn calls them Brindians in his sort of classic book of martial races. So it's really a case where the regulation and the practice are not in line with each other at all.
We have another question here, which is, could you please comment on John Dorian, director and one-year chairman of EIC?
I'm afraid I cannot comment on John Dorian. I don't know enough about him or kind of his importance. If the person who wants to, or who asked that question wants to give more details or kind of a date range, I could maybe take a better stab at it.
Well, maybe that date range will come in. Another question is there any evidence that the majority or any number of the officers revolting against civil authority in Madras were Scots or Irish, and there were ancient enmities involved? There were men, for example, from Jacobite families serving in the Madras army.
So you're absolutely correct that another one of the aspects of the kind of complexity of the politics of this period that I did not get into were the kinds of origins of the officers and their kind of social status, and particularly the patronage networks as they work in India. And to speak kind of generalizingly, Bengal and the Bengal army in the 18th century kind of tended to draw from more English patronage networks, and Madras tended to draw from more Scottish patronage networks. And there absolutely is hostility between Bengal and Madras, in part on those lines, and also just because there's sort of this recognition of separate patronage networks, and Madras officers kind of consistently feeling that they are subordinate to the supreme government in Bengal and sort of smarting at that. And Barlow, who actually sort of came up as a civil servant in the Bengal presidency, one of the reasons why, even before he starts his military reforms, he's already not popular with the military class in Madras because of that. And Andrew McKillop has done great work on Madras as sort of a center of these Scottish patronage networks. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting there is that is something where we see sort of the sympathies exist both in the civil and the military agents in Madras. And so there's actually an earlier sort of coup against George Pigott in the 1770s in Madras that I didn't talk about in my lecture just for time, but that I talk about in my book. And in that case, we see more of an alliance between civil and military actors. And I would suspect that the Scottishness comes in more to play in that particular case than in 1809.
Mm-hmm. Another question here is, where is the best source of information of Madras Native Infantry Regiment history? Their lineages and amalgamations seem quite complex.
Excellent question. It sort of depends on what types of information that you want. Certainly, I would say that the British Library and then in Chennai, the Tamil Nadu State Archives are the kind of two places where you really have the kind of wealth of records from the company's armies, and in particular in the Tamil Nadu State Archives, you have the military department documents, many of which are also in London, but you also have a series that's called the Madras Army Records. And those actually have kind of more specific details about regimental musters and things like that. But I would also say that the work of the 19th century and 20th century archivist Henry Dodwell has a lot of sort of guides to the Madras Army that would be sort of good places to start.
Mm-hmm. We've got another comment here by the same questioner who mentions the 26th or 27th Wallajabad light infantry in particular as an example, I suppose, of complex lineages and amalgamations.
Yes, and it is incredibly complex, in part because, especially in the 18th century, I feel like um, every decade or so, you see an attempt to kind of reform the establishment of the native armies and to create a kind of new organizational structure. And it can be really difficult in the records to trace that sort of movement. And in particular, because you then have officers who become supernumerary and sort of move between different regiments. But I think if you have a specific one that you're looking for, that would actually be a really good way to start looking at Dodwell or W.J. Wilson, who I quoted briefly in the talk, who's the 19th century archivist who wrote the history of the Madras Army, would actually give you probably a possibility of tracing that timeline.
This is a question of my own. If you're working in the Hyderabadi archives or the
Yes.
Tamil Nadu ones, what language are you working in both of them?
So in so the records that I'm looking at are predominantly the English record from the company. And then I was also looking at Persian material from Arcot, in particular, the Muhammad Ali Khan Wala Jah, the Nawab of Arcot, and then from Asif Shah II and the Nizam of Hyderabad. And their administrative language is Mughal Persian. Of course, the day-to-day language spoke in the Tamil Nadu or in Madras is or Chennai is Tamil, and in Hyderabad you have a number of different languages, including Telugu. That said, I do not speak either Telugu or Tamil, unfortunately, and was able to navigate the archives with predominantly in English.
Mm-hmm. Two questions here. The first is, who were the military paymasters at the various phases?
So excellent question. And this is one of the things that really gets sort of hotly contested in this period, because every once in a while there are figures like Barlow who try to shift the kind of paymaster structure increasingly towards civilian actors. And that is something that is very fiercely protested by officers. And at the same time, the military paymasters are in a position that sometimes puts them at odds with the rest of the officers because they are kind of more embedded in the administration of the company. I'm thinking in particular the 1809 mutiny. One of the kind of inciting factors is actually the arrest of military. Well, actually, sorry, it's the quartermaster general, not the military paymaster. John Monroe, who initially wrote a report about the savings to be realized by shifting the equipping contracts to civilians over military actors. What's also really interesting to me, and going back to this question of the divide between Bengal and Madras, Bengal officers very regularly were on service in Madras in the 18th century because of because Madras is where some of the fiercest fighting is going on, especially against Mysore. And regularly, we actually see Bengal officers, probably because they have access to more prestigious patronage networks, able to take those really lucrative positions like military paymaster from their Madrasi counterparts. And that becomes a question of or that becomes a source of conflict as well, and also kind of becomes an interesting vector where you can see exchange across presidency lines.
We've got another question here. It's about martial race theory, which you
Yes.
touched on, talking briefly about McMahon. This questioner says, martial race theory identified some races as biologically suited to soldiering, such as Gurkhas and Sikhs, and others not. Did this rest on how formidable these races had been as opponents of the British? Why were Bengalis considered unworthy when the uprising of 1857 was sparked by the revolt of the Bengal army?
This is an excellent question, and one that, uh, again, Kate Imey's Faithful Fighters is a great book, and if you're interested, I would definitely say read that. But to answer more specifically, one of the things that historians like Imey and Heather Street Salter have argued is that the emergence of the martial race theory actually is hugely influenced by the events of 1857. Um, there's actually, you can see quite far back into the 1700s, various kind of remarks and reports and discussion by company officials that certain types of Indians are better suited for military labor than others. And I actually, in my book, try to use this to get a sense of how recruiting pools and recruiting networks are shifting over time. But you don't have the kind of solidification of this into this formalized theory of martial races until after 1857. And what you see with the kind of identification of the Sikhs and the Gurkhas is that they are supposed to represent the kind of ideal combination of formidableness and loyalty. And there's sort of this idea in particular about the Gurkhas that in comparison to Bengalis, who are at this point being talked about as overly superstitious and too easily led astray by Brahmin priests and other religious figures. You have one anecdote that McMunn gives in his book on the theory of martial races, where supposedly a group of Brahmins came to try to persuade a regiment of Gurkhas to rebel against the company, but they were so attached to their soldierly obedience that there was no chance that they would kind of waver. And so I think what you're actually seeing with the theory of martial races is this attempt to explain some of the events of 1857, to explain how did we lose the attachment and obedience of sepoys, and how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again. Previously, they had previously company officers had claimed that their personal relationship and command over sepoys created that obedience. After 1857, you increasingly see officials making the argument that, in fact, they can solve this problem at a kind of higher up level by focusing on races that are inherently obedient.
Now, the questioner who was asking about John Dorian,
Yes.
a bit more information. John Dorian, circa 1714 to 84, merchant banker, director of EIC, 1755 to 58, 1760, 1761, 62, 1763, deputy chair of EIC, 1762, and chair of EIC, 1763. His son, George Dorian, was governor of the Bank of England, 1818 to 1820.
So Dorian then is involved in company politics in a really interesting era for the company's politics in the metropole. It's the period sort of just after the company's territory really begins to expand into what is increasingly recognized as an empire with the Battle of Plassey and then the Treaty of Allahabad in the 1750s and 1760s. And one of the things that we are seeing in this period is uh, the sort of value and importance and social sort of significance of the company increasing in British metropolitan politics. And so just hearing those dates, one of the things that strikes me is the kind of oh, he's chair for this short period of time and then he's not chair anymore. And one of the things that shows you is the turbulence of politics, that as one faction sort of comes to a head in the company politics in the metropole, he gets that position. When that faction falls out of favor, he loses that position. So if you're more interested in that kind of process, I would point you to the classic work of Lucy Sutherland on the East India Company in British politics in this period. And that could be a much more informed answer than what I can do just based on my hazarding a guess here.
Christina, we've got another question which, out of pity for you, probably ought to be the last lecture.
Okay.
We've talked almost solidly for 2 hours, and you must be flagging, although you're not showing it, I have to say. The question is, and it's probably an appropriate one for you, are there any useful parallels that can be drawn between rebellions in the Madras Army in the late 18th century and events in the United States?
I will say that it was a curious feeling, because I was actually revising my chapter on the 1809 rebellion when the January 6th insurrection news broke. And it was a very curious feeling, because one of the kind of key issues in 1809, which is this question of a group that is embedded within elite hierarchies, uh, moving against the system in which they are elite. There are definite parallels that you can see, I think, in the United States today, in terms of the way that racial politics in the US have become increasingly heated around this sort of question of white privilege. And I think January 6th is a really important example of that. One of the things that I think is potentially most important is that you have with 1809 this initial sort of reaction of, this is too far, this is treasonable, but that over time, that initial reaction to the officers' mutiny is increasingly muted in favor of them sort of being more successful in getting a lot of their aims. And increasingly, you get the event kind of swept under the rug. And one of the things that I think is particularly important as a job for historians is sort of thinking about ways that the kind of importance of events, how not to water them down as they become increasingly part of the past. And I think that's something that the civil government of the company was not able to do in 1809, but I think is a really important lesson, kind of thinking today about politics, is to not allow systemic not allow kind of systemic patterns to paper over and wash away things that really ought to be seen as alarming or in need of change. Uh, Unfortunately, I don't have a way to fix all of American politics, so I apologize for that.
Well, our question says this is a fascinating and quite unexpected set of observations, because I was in fact thinking about the events leading up to the American War of Independence.
Well, I apologize, but in that case, let me just very quickly say, there's actually a really interesting a comparison that I talk a little bit more about in my book, which is that you will often see, in particular, supporters of officers claim, oh, you can't take away the officers' allowances or perquisites or privileges, because if you do, they're going to go the way that America went. and this idea that officers might become another set of American revolutionaries is something that really circulates in the 1780s and 1790s ahead of the consolidation debates. And I talk about that a little more in my book, but it's definitely an analogy.
Well, Christina, thank you again for your absolutely fascinating and your outstanding talk. It's obvious from the your infectious enthusiasm and your expansive discussion and generosity how really absorbed you've been in your subject, and with enormous beneficiaries of that. And I certainly commend your book to everyone else here. It's a marvelous book, and I hope it goes into paperback. But anyway, there's a reasonably generous discount there from Cambridge University Press, and Christina's book's well worth reading, even if you just have to borrow a copy from a library. So thank you, Christina. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has attended this talk today. And I very much hope to see you again at our next talk on Tuesday, the 15th November, when historian and expert on pornography and 18th century sexuality, Julie Peakman, discusses sexual attitudes and behavior in India during the Mughal and British periods. So,
Valerie, sorry, I think you got the date wrong because you said Tuesday, November 15th, which is...
well, look it up, everyone. It's in December, and it's roughly a month from now. So have a look on the website, and thanks for picking me up on that, Christina. At your end, I can see. So fantastic, Christina. Thank you so much, and I'll be in touch. Email you about thanks and various other things. And thank you, everyone, so much for turning up. And good night, Christina, and good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.